Hello and welcome to another installment of Tinker Time with KG7UJF. Consider this. The following video contains shop language. If this offends you, it is best to leave now. I don't have a lot of video for the assembly of this shelving unit. I ended up deleting a significant portion because I didn't really plan for doing these videos, and in that vein I ended up with a lack of memory on my computer, so I had to delete stuff back and forth as I worked my way through this. We're pretty well picking up with the assembly of the rack itself. I was attempting to make sure that it was level vertically, but it was still kind of a crapshoot. The hardware that I ended up using to attach these verticals, as you can see, it's machine bolts. I was using, I think they were 832 half-inch bolts, or machine screws, which were overkill, but it was more about the aesthetic. You can see one on that bottom right in the video that's a little bit smaller. That was because the way that some of these holes were drilled didn't allow me to use the bigger bolt, or the bigger screw. I'm going to call them bolts throughout this thing, but the bigger screw, because it put the screw itself too close to the angle to get the nut on it on the back side. I just didn't plan that far ahead, so I ended up having to use some smaller screws, especially on that lower level. We can see that I had a change in my initial plan with this shelving unit. I was going to attempt to build another layer on top of the one that is there, but when I got everything laid out and kind of placed in about this point, well, right before this point, I knew that it would just be too unwieldy to have a third bay for equipment in there. I just didn't want to build a box that was quite that big, so I decided to stick with this the way that it is currently, and cut a level off. There you can see where those machine screws are, and you can see the really tight space to deal with there, and why maybe an 832 wouldn't work, and why I had to use a 632 to get a little bit more slop in it. Most of the audio from these later videos didn't come through all that well. That's why I'm doing this voiceover instead of cutting the audio and cutting the audio like I did in the other video. I started to get really quiet and just focused on what I was doing. This was about a 9-hour, 8-hour build, somewhere in there. It took more time than I thought that it would, and eventually I just needed to start paying attention to what was going on, and I kind of quit talking so much. I just wanted to get it done and put it into use. It was supposed to be a pretty quick project, and it ended up being a bit more than I bargained for. And here we can see that I'm having to pirate more of those smaller screws from the lower level, or I guess I'm putting the smaller ones down low so I can pirate the bigger ones to go into the second level. So as you go up visually, your eyes drawn more towards the middle of it, make sure that they're all the same size as much as I could, because I started to run out of machine screws. My material planning from the beginning wasn't all that great. I was off by about... Well, I didn't use the material that I had effectively, and I ended up with a lot of scrap that I could have put to better use. I just didn't pay close enough attention to the materials I was using, and I ended up having to buy more as time went on, especially of the angle. And then somewhere in my shop, there is still a 6-foot piece of this aluminum angle. I just don't know where it is. I looked for probably 45 minutes for it. I bought it one morning on my way to work at the blood bank, and took it out the night when I got home, but I do not remember what I did with it. So somebody somewhere has a 6-foot chunk of aluminum. I find it in my shop and I'll give you bit of a reward. I know it made it into the shop. I remember taking it out, and there were 2 additional chunks of this 16th inch plate, aluminum plate stuff that's making these shelves, that I bought at the same time, and they were sitting there as well, or they were part of that load and came in to the shop, and they were sitting right there. So I don't know where that aluminum went to. That annoys the hell out of me. So that stuff that you saw put in the opening there is pretty nifty. I think that it's meant for fireplaces and fireplace screens, but I decided to shaky cam. I decided to use it to make up the sides of this rack, which would allow for some good airflow to come through. It is not horribly difficult to work with, but with the way that it cuts with tin snips, I learned it leaves a lot of really fine shavings, little slivers that they end up getting stuck in your hand. It's just the way that the aluminum has been perforated. It tends to like to splinter instead of shear, and I ended up getting it stuck in my hands in a few different spots. This would not be the ideal way that I would do this in really any respect. The screws and the rivets are kind of a cool visual, I think. I like the look of it, but I would have much rather been able to weld this together. It would have been much better than this system that I did. The reason that I used 4 machine screws on every level was essentially trying to weld it without having a welder, because if I would have just put 1 screw in, it would have been really easy for things to twist and weeble wobble, since each one of these sides of this box, or sides of the shelf with the angle iron going on the horizontal plane, aren't tied together. If I didn't have 2 points of contact coming into the uprights, I felt that I'd get too much tweak and too much weeble wobble in things, and it wouldn't be firm enough. That one machine screw would act as a pivot and not really hold itself the way that I wanted it to. And that's the screening that we used. It was important for me to get the aesthetics of this right, because if the box is out of square itself a little bit, it's not going to be horribly noticeable unless you're paying attention to it. And I know that it's out of square, and I see that. But if this were not cut straight, if this didn't fit very well, I felt that it would cause a lot of problems visually, because it is so many straight lines with the way these holes are cut. It would be noticeable if things weren't quite the way they should be. I learned a trick doing the second level of this, and I should have used it on this level. What I should have done is, with that top shelf, the shelf in the middle there, I should have scribed the bottom edge of that, and then I should have pulled that shelf back out. If I would have done that and got a good measurement for how long that perforated aluminum had to be, I could have done this in a much cleaner way. The bottom two layers, or this perforated material in the bottom section there, isn't to my standards. It isn't quite fit in there the way that it should be in the final product, because I was fighting with the upper shelf too much. I really should have pulled it out, or put the shelf in, put the top shelf in, put the lid on, essentially, scribed everything out, taken the middle shelf out, put the perforated material in, put the second shelf back in, taken the top shelf out, and then done the top perforated metal with the second shelf back in. That way I would have had something to keep everything square. And you can kind of see on that top left of center area there that just disappeared, that it does have some wiggle in it. It isn't completely perfect, but I learned and did the top layer quite a bit better. You can see how it's kind of recessed like that. And yeah, I mean, part of that is, if I could do it again, I would weld this thing, because I could weld that perforated material to the shelf up top, and on the bottom I could just do a little spot weld, and it would take a lot of the weeble wobble out of it. There just wasn't a lot of rigidity in that material, where the plate aluminum had enough that if it would have been placed in a manner like that, it wouldn't have waved quite as bad as this stuff did. the side that's up right now ended up looking quite a bit better than the side that's on the bottom that I'm working on right now, just in my humble opinion of it. Getting the rivets to match up with holes on that perforated material was not something that I necessarily anticipated. I think, in all honesty, or thinking on it now, I could have used some plate or some strap aluminum to go on the inside edge and kind of made a sandwich between the angle and the strap and that perforated material, and probably done a bit better job with this. Because that perforated stuff, the larger holes that you can see there were the perfect size to accept, and they were 1/8-inch holes, so they accepted my 1/8-inch rivets just perfectly, until I got off center a little bit, and trying to drill through that stuff just did not do anything for me. It just ended up ripping that material and caused a lot of problems. I'm glad that at least the fly in my pajamas were buttoned up through a majority of the filming of this video, or that would just be awkward. And now the first layer is essentially done, and I had a piece of scrap that I'd miscut that I wanted to try and figure out how to use. At this point, I was just double-checking things and kind of considering where things were going to live. I was also mocking in this top shelf, or the lid. Essentially just trying to get it to where it would eventually be. Just put one screw in each corner to try and hold everything tight and where it wanted to be, so I could get the rest of the holes drilled. I think at this time I didn't have enough machine screws to really complete everything that I wanted to do, but I at least was able to get the holes drilled and make ready for the time that I did have all of the screws. This was kind of a tedious operation that took a lot of work to get right, because, like I said, all of these individual pieces of angle iron that make up the shelves were independent of each other. They were tied into the shelving itself, into the plate, but they weren't tied into each other. So as you're screwing or drilling holes in these corners like this, it was very easy for things to kind of flip-flop around and migrate. So it took a lot of planning and troubleshooting to try and get things in straight. Now, in this instance, I decided to scribe the bottom of the shelving on the vertical angle iron, it is an angle iron, angle aluminum pieces, to determine the length or the height of the perforated aluminum that I needed. As I mentioned in the previous instance where I was working with the material, I should have done this for the lower section, because it made things much easier. And And especially because you can't really tell unless you really are looking at it, but this isn't completely square at this point. So we're working with the angle of the dangle, and because of that, I'm able to, or because of the way that I did this, I'm able to account for that angle of the dangle and not cut something straight across that's not going to fit straight across and make things look all fugly. If the fucker'd get things in frame, that might be a little bit helpful. I think I'm feckering around trying to get the holes drilled for the rivets to hold this perforated material in place. And he's not gonna get a single feckin' bit of it in frame, is he? That's okay. We like looking at the holes in my jeans and my moccasin slippers out in the garage. You know, safety first, folks. Safety first. This ended up being a bit more tedious a project than I initially anticipated. I'm gonna have a follow-up kind of analysis video at the end of all this after all of these get shot or edited and done up, that we're gonna kind of go over some of this stuff that I learned in a bit more detail than what I'm doing here, and look at the final product, see how it's set up right now, see where it's living, all of that fun stuff. But I'm glad that I built this with my own two hands. That did end up being a pretty high source of pride, but this was a tedious son of a bitch. There was a lot of work that went into this, beyond what I really thought it was going to take when I set out to build this thing. So I think we can see here that this ended up looking quite a bit better than the bottom layers of this material. It's still kind of kinky and still kind of difficult to work with this material, but it did end up working a little bit better than the lower usage of this material. My initial plan when I started was I was gonna paint all of the straight aluminum black and leave the side panels aluminum silver colored, but quite honestly, by the time I got to this point, I was so pleased to just be done with the fucking thing that I couldn't bear the thought of trying to mask off that aluminum and leave it silver. And I'm really happy with the way that it turned out, all being black. I think it would have looked like shit if we would have made an attempt to leave it silver. I just don't think that it would have worked all that well. this really was the technique for working with that sheet aluminum. It was 16th of an inch. I think somewhere I said it was quarter inch. That was bullshit. 16th inch aluminum plate or sheet metal. Scoring it with the work knife and then going about it in that fashion and bending it and breaking it was definitely the way to go. Those tin snips were... I knew that they weren't going to work, but I had hopes that they would. And yeah, I mean, it would just ended up being a nightmare. It was not a lot of fun. And I was just test fit, and I have the same power supply in the shop that I have in my rack in my ham station. So I wanted to make sure that everything was going to work. Start running everything through. And importantly, at this point, none of the top shelf is screwed in yet. I hadn't yet drilled the holes that the head unit there or the plate were going to mount to. So we had to get all of that lined out before I bolted that shelf in, because I wasn't going to have enough room to work with it once that ended up happening. I make a habit of labeling the inside of all the cases of the equipment that I have with the year that I got it and my call sign, to especially where I end up with two of them, to make sure, you know, if they ever got swapped out or something, I can remember when I got something, and in case it ends up getting stolen, I can always say that the inside of something has my call sign on it with the date that I got it, or something similar to that. So the rig runner gets hooked up. I am really happy with those. I've got 3 of them now, and they just work really well. I'm really pleased with them all the way around. They're good little chunks of machinery. And, you know, we've just got to figure out with that antenna analyzer, or that SWR bridge in there, the coax cable that I had is only so long, so we've got to get a level for that. We've got to elongate the cable, power supply cable that I had coming from the radio to the rig runner, because things weren't set up exactly the way that they were previously. Means putting on power poles and making essentially a jumper. I think I made it about 1.5 feet. I didn't measure it. I just kind of looked and saw where things needed to go. I suppose that I could have redone the wiring from the power supply to the rig runner and moved the rig runner upstairs into that second level, but that I had power going either which way. The wiring on the radio is just short. It had been cut a couple times. This is putting power poles on the banana, well, it isn't a banana plug, but the plug supplied with that antenna analyzer, so when everything's plugged into the rig runner, the indicator light turns on the meter of the SWR meter. And yeah, things are kind of laid out, and we kind of know where we want them to go. That speaker was the first speaker that I bought with that radio. Since this has been shot, I received the kind of short, rectangular Kenwood-esque speaker that I really like. And I've replaced that thing. That's sitting in a junk drawer right now. I don't really like that speaker after experiencing some others. But yeah, the radio bracket for the body gets mounted down. Well, the holes get drilled for it anyway. It's not permanently mounted until after I paint things, but that gets mounted down. Everything kind of gets pulled apart again. And that bracket there is the ugly, fugly angle iron, legit angle iron bracket that I built when I first bought that radio and installed it 2 years ago or so. Just what I had floating around the shop in Montana. So it served its purpose, and I still haven't changed it out yet. I have a bunch of scrap aluminum angle iron, but I haven't changed that thing out yet. It does what I need it to do, and nobody sees it at this point, so what's the point? Lighter fluid to clean off all the fingerprints, and sticker juice residue that's left over from the angle iron and plate, clean off the Sharpie marks and things like that to make sure when we paint this thing that the paint looks somewhat decent.